Hi everyone, it's Katie, and today I have a deck review for you. This is a deck I've had since the beginning of the year, and it's a deck that I've been wanting to review for quite a while. But it's also a really powerful deck with so many layers to it. So I wanted to work with it quite a bit to make sure that if and when I did the review that I really did this deck justice. And that deck is the Spiral Tarot. This is by Kay Stephenson, published by US Games. Now this is an older printing. I just wanted to get that out of the way. I don't think much has changed, but just in case if I'm talking about cardstock and it's a little bit different, perhaps that's why. I do also have the companion book, which is now out of print, but I've seen it really quite cheap on eBay and Gumtree and stuff. I don't think this is absolutely necessary to work with the deck, but I do think it's a really good companion book. So I will be talking about it a little bit in this review. It is out of print, but if you really connect with this deck and you want to get the most out of it, it might be worth looking into this book. In the two little title cards, you just get, well, the title card, and then we have another card that reads, "The Spiral Tarot deck is dedicated to my Celtic grandmother, who used to read playing cards when I was a child. It was she who guided me through a perilous journey. She instilled in me the philosophy that life is like an ancient symbol, the spiral. Each phase of life has a beginning, runs its course, and comes to an end before moving to the next cycle. The ultimate aspiration is to be like the tarot fool, not allowing past experiences to hold us back, but embracing the new cycle with an open heart and mind, each time with a little more wisdom." So we'll get the specifics out of the way first. This deck is a little bit smaller. It kind of feels a little bit more like the Osho Zen size. It's pretty much the same width. This is a regular Rider-Waite-Smith card. Yeah, it's the same width, but it's quite a bit shorter, the Spiral Tarot. So it's actually quite a nice size in the hand, I think. The cardstock, I quite like it. It feels sturdy, it feels solid. It has a bit of a plastic feel, but not as much as some of those like yellow box Rider-Waite-Smiths do. But as I said, this is an older printing, so I don't want to go too much into that because I think it might have changed. The backing is really quite pretty, simple. The borders are something that I know a lot of people don't like and has actually stopped a lot of people getting this deck at all. I've fallen in love with this deck so much that I just don't care about the borders anymore. Now I think you could trim it, but I don't think it'd be as easy as some decks. You'd have to decide what to do with the title at the bottom. And I think also the corners, you might either have to actually cut the corners, which I wouldn't be game to do, or get quite a bit of a bigger corner rounder rather than just the little ones. And I think I've seen one person trim it. But as I said, I don't have any intention of doing so. It would also make it quite a small deck. I don't have any intention of doing so, and I've kind of learned to accept the borders for what they are. Now into the deck. The artwork is absolutely beautiful, I think. The colours are rich. There's quite a lot of symbolism in these cards, especially in the mages. And then again, mostly elemental symbolism and a bit of astrological symbolism in the courts. They're beautiful imagery though. I really enjoy this deck. The mages are perhaps a little bit more intricate than the minors, but I've never, laid out the cards and it felt stark or jarring. For example, this is the Wheel of Fortune, and we can see there's a whole bunch of different symbols in there. This has become a very important deck in my collection. It's not a deck that I use all day, every day, but it is a deck I use regularly. This deck is very much steeped in archetypes, which you would especially find evident if you got your hands on the guidebook. This is very heavily reliant on archetypes, and so I think that is why it works so well with that unconscious, subconscious stuff. It's really potent. Having said that, as powerful as this deck can be, I've also found it very accessible. It is based largely on the Rider-Waite-Smith system, which you can see in most cards. There's a bit of a shifting with some aspects of the cards, but for the most part it's very much based on Rider-Waite-Smith. I actually used this deck for the first half of the Within Without Advice challenge that a lot of us did on Instagram, so it was a deck that I was using daily, but it wasn't a walk in the park. It was definitely bringing up some really, it wasn't overwhelmingly heavy, but it was some stuff that I needed to work with. It can be used for those more quick fire sort of messages if you want it to be, but I think it's most useful, most powerful, most effective when you give it some time, when you sit with it and you're prepared to journal with it, because there's so much in these cards. There's so many layers and levels to the messages that you can get, which makes it really versatile too. As I said, I prefer it with those messages that it takes more time and more of a psycho-spiritual sort of angle, but it can be used for the lighter everyday sides as well. But it brings a level of importance, mindfulness to the situation. I don't think there's any cards that I really don't like in this deck. I think it's a really beautiful, well done, well thought out deck. I don't feel like there's anything missing. I don't feel like anything could have really been done better. I really appreciate the way in which this deck has been done, and I think it's achieved the goal of creating a beautiful, readable, powerful, emotive deck. There's a lot of movement in this deck in the imagery as well, which I find really inspiring, which I find really interesting to read with. The colours are lovely, and I love the characters are really well done. The characters that are portrayed really feel alive, really feel like you can commune with them, that you can learn from them. The play of light and shadow in this deck is really well done as well. And I think the emotion is really brought through in the images, in the colouring, in that light and shadow, in the faces of the individuals. It's a deck that I just really enjoy reading with. And I know that when I pull this deck out, I'm going to get some important, powerful messages. I don't know, not that I perhaps feel it's not true for other decks, but I feel like I really trust the messages that come through in this deck. Like, they feel really well informed, well educated, certain messages. That's not to say that they're not complex and there's not layers to those messages, but they just feel sure. And that's something that I really appreciate, especially when I'm reading for others. I particularly love the way that she's depicted the devil, that we see the reflection and the woman really not liking what she's seeing. The aces all look really, they feel very elemental, very primal. This one is perhaps the most traditional as far as the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery is concerned, but I just love this Ace of Pentacles. And then the Ace of Swords is again that more elemental sort of imagery. It's beautiful. As far as the courts are concerned, they feel very progressive, very much a family unit. The pages, or the princesses, are all young girls, and they're just beautiful. I think the princesses are some of my favourite cards in this deck. And then the knights, they all have their horses, and they're all those young, dashing men. And then the queens are all very regal, very powerful, as are the kings. So I really like the way that the courts are done. I think I was one of those people that struggled with the courts for quite a while, but these courts feel very distinct, very clear, that they are separate and that they follow a progression, but they have their own traits, their own association. So the Little White Book is fairly substantial for a Little White Book, I think. The Major Arcana, you get a little like 1 or 2 sentences talking about the imagery, and then a divinatory meaning, which is about the same sort of amount of information. And this is all taken from the larger guidebook, so it's the same information, just obviously 1 or 2 sentences, not a whole page. So in the guidebook, for each of the numbers, so we start, like for example the 5s, it has just a little brief introduction to what all of the 5s are talking about, and it associates those with the appropriate major arcana. So for example, the fives belong to the Hierophant. They each capture a situation where one must confront one's own truth. So I'll just read out a few of the examples from the Little White Book to give you an idea of what you get. I've just picked out some cards at random, and so we'll start with the Lovers. The Lovers are the alchemical king and queen. They embrace in a fertile garden with the roses of the Empress, the High Priestess's pomegranates, and the lush colours of life. The divinatory meaning: a crossroads where choices must be made, usually involving a relationship, loving relationships, and discrimination. For a minor, I've pulled the Eight of Pentacles. A smith is working at his craft. He is highly skilled and successful. Divinatory meaning: profitable times are ahead, connected to the material or personal matters. There is a need to focus on your talents or take your skills to the wider world. So everything you get in here is kind of just like a one-line, two-line excerpt from the larger book. So this guidebook is, I think, a really great addition, and I think it really complements the deck well. It really lifts up your understanding of the imagery rather than just providing generic meanings. It's about 150 pages long. Now, each of the major arcana cards have a lot of information, like 3, 4, 5 pages worth of information. They all have the card represented as well, which is helpful, just in black and white. And at first it talks about the myth. So for example, the Fool, we meet the young Percival, and it talks about his myth, and then it talks about more specifically how that relates to the card, and then at the end we just have a small paragraph for actual divinatory meaning. But I think the way that this deck uses myths and archetypes is really, really powerful. It's really cleverly done. It doesn't feel at all like, you know, she just randomly picked a myth and tried to fit it into the card. It really feels like these myths embody the card meaning, the archetype held within each of the cards of tarot. I think the myths and the archetypes have been chosen really, really well. And also having these myths, connecting these myths and archetypes to the cards in tarot, it's really improved and deepened my understanding of the cards. It's added a whole new layer. And so this deck, obviously I love working with this deck, but working with this deck has in turn improved my own understanding of tarot as a system. Going along with what I've already said about this deck, I think this guidebook, everything that's kind of provided in the guidebook, definitely has that psycho-spiritual element to it. That, I think, is really the focus of this deck. I mean, that's obvious when you think about that the myths and the archetypes are so important to how this deck has been constructed. And so this book, this guidebook, only furthers that understanding. Now for the meanings for each of the minor arcana, there's quite a bit less information, but still really good information. For the swords, it tells us what the element is, air, the symbols such as clouds, birds and butterflies, and the color in this deck is blue. As in the Little White Book, at the beginning of each of the numbers, we have a bit of information about that number itself before we talk about the individual cards of that number. There's also quite a bit of information about the Tree of Life in connection to this deck. Not too much. I'm not really well versed in the Kabbalah and Tree of Life in terms of tarot, but there is enough in here to kind of get you start thinking in that way. And all of the minor arcana, you just get a small reproduction of the image. I don't want to talk too much about this guidebook because I know it's not available anymore, but I will say, if you like this deck, if you're attracted to this deck, and you want to get more into the cards, you want to understand more about the stories that have been selected, the myths and the archetypes that have been used for the images, I really do think this is a great companion book. And as I said, I've seen it on eBay for $20 or $30. I know that there's one on Gumtree right now with the deck for Australians, if you're interested. I really do think that this adds a lot to the use of this deck. It's not the sort of guidebook that I go back to every time I'm reading with the deck. Some guidebooks feel like that. They feel like you need to reread just to make sure you've got everything. I don't feel like that at all with this deck. I've read through it, and I'm sure I'll read through it again every now and then, but I've read through it and I feel like I've absorbed enough to just get where the cards are coming from that much more. I know a lot of us here on YouTube really focus on the archetypes of the tarot, of the way that tarot can help us better understand ourselves and our approach to the world. I think that is where this deck absolutely shines. I don't know that this deck would be as powerful for those more, you know, will my boyfriend break up with me sort of questions. I mean, perhaps it would be, but I think where this deck absolutely excels is that really overt depiction of myths and archetypes within the cards of tarot, and the lessons we can learn from those archetypes, the way we can embody and understand the archetypes. That is where this deck excels, and I think it just does it so well. Having said all that, there are some decks that are very, very archetype focused that sometimes feel inaccessible unless you know that archetype, that myth really well. I don't feel like that about this deck. I used this deck for quite a little while before I even touched this book, and because it's still very, very traditional in a lot of ways, not limited by Rider-Waite, but it's got that core foundation in Rider-Waite, and because the images are really quite evocative in and of themselves, because the images don't overtly, explicitly say this is a certain goddess from a certain mythology, you can still read this deck, even if, you know, all of this mythology, archetype stuff isn't what you want to get into. It's just that when you do get into all of that stuff, there's so many layers to this deck. So personally, I love this deck. I've gotten so much out of this deck, you know, from a personal development sort of space, from a spiritual space, and then also just a tarot, learning tarot space. This deck has been absolutely wonderful, and I love this deck. I think it's beautiful, but most importantly, I think it's rich. It's rich in symbolism, in meaning. It has so many layers to it. It's powerful because of its richness. So I hope you found this review helpful. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any comments or questions about this deck or about the guidebook, please feel free to leave those below and I will get back to you. As I said, I really, really love this deck, and I guess ultimately, if this deck appeals to you, please don't let the border deter you, because this deck has so much to offer. So I'll talk to you guys all in the comments, and I will see you very soon. Much love. Bye.